Hello and welcome to another episode of Mind Ki Baat, where we discuss not your tan and shall I say man, but the part that really matters, your mind, specifically the mental health. I am your neurodivergent host, Shardul, and in this episode we'll discuss a major mental illness which people don't really know about and don't really understand, which is bipolar disorder.
We know that about 10 to 15% of bipolar patients die with
काफी
suicide.
गाने थे, एक पंजाबी फिल्म कर रहा था, तो उसके बीच में सब कुछ एकदम मेरा ब्रेकडाउन हुआ और मेरा दिमाग काम करना बंद कर गया और मुझे समझ में नहीं आ रहा था ये सिम्टम्स जो हैं ये क्या हैं.
It is a health issue. This is like a sprained brain, like having a sprained ankle.
When I first got out, I didn't know how I'd cope with my diagnosis. What if it happened again? What if the next time I didn't come back?
Behind my smile is a breaking heart. Behind my laugh, I'm falling apart. Behind my eyes are tears at night. And behind my body is a soul trying to fight.
ट्रोमाटाइज वो बीमारी बहुत खतरनाक है, मतलब बहुत ही खतरनाक.
I just found that it was really freeing to have the information. It made me really happy because I started to have a relationship with myself.
I had bipolar disorder meant that I was going to be limited in some way.
This is a Newslaundry podcast, and you're listening to Mind Ki Baat.
To give us their insights on bipolar, we have two special guests with us. Sandhya is a former journalist and a writer. And after spending 18 years in journalism, she now works as a communication specialist. She lives in Bangalore and is a single mother of 2 teenage children. Hello, Sandhya.
Hi.
Sandhya tells me she primarily writes about parenting and mental health, and she does this through her personal experiences. And she received her diagnosis of bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder 10 years ago. And since then, she's been pretty vocal about mental health issues and conversations around it. So we're glad to have you with us, Sandhya.
Happy to be here, guys.
Our second guest is Dr. Alok Kulkarni. Alok is a senior consultant psychiatrist with 11 years of experience at Manas Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, which is in Hubli, Karnataka. And he was trained at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, NIMHANS, Bangalore. We've mentioned your hospital earlier too on this podcast. And he was awarded IMH Marshall Fellowship Award by University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, Canada. And this was awarded to him in 2022-2023 to pursue research on bipolar disorder. And he told us that besides work, he likes sports, literature, comedy. So hello, Alok, and great to have you here.
Hi, Shardul and Sandhya. Thanks for having me here.
So before I go to our guests and we start the conversation, let me give you some basic facts. According to Mayo Clinic, bipolar disorder was formerly known as manic depression, and it's a mental health condition that causes extreme mood swings, or I think intense emotional states would be the right definition. From the conversation I had with a couple of people I know, they said it's like we're more emotional rather than it's a mood swing. It's much heavier than a mood swing. But our guests would correct me if I'm wrong. And when we say, extreme mood swings or extreme emotional states, believe me, they are extreme and can even last for weeks, which is the primary issue with being bipolar. And this quite often severely affects a person's ability to function in life. So I want to go to you first, Alok. I was reading about bipolar disorder and I am only familiar with it through a couple of people. And they are not very open about their conditions, although they are part of a group which is for neurodivergent people who have different problems. But they are not very open about it. So could you tell our listeners, I read there are 3 types. So could you explain it to our listeners what these 3 types are? What are the differences?
Right. So as you mentioned, bipolar disorder is a serious mental illness which is characterized by dramatic shifts in mood, energy and activity levels, which affect a person's ability to carry out day-to-day tasks. These shifts in mood and energy levels are more severe than the normal ups and downs experienced by everyone. Bipolar basically represents a pathological change in one's mood, energy, and activity levels between two opposite poles. What happens generally is that it is frequently called a mood disorder. The term mood disorder is some sort of a misnomer because there is not just the mood that is affected, but also the energy and activity levels that are affected. Broadly, there are 3 types of bipolar disorder, and I would be speaking about bipolar disorder type 1 and type 2. The other type is called the cyclothymic disorder, which is less common as compared to bipolar disorder type 1 and type 2. So you were right when you mentioned about manic depressive illness. Bipolar disorder was earlier referred to as manic depressive illness, and this concept was given by Emil Kraepelin in the year 1898. Manic depressive illness referred to recurrent mood episodes of any kind. So manic depressive illness, if a person had 100 depressive episodes, he would still, and 0 manic episodes, he would still be referred to as having a manic depressive illness. But the concept of bipolar disorder came into being with the advent of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 3 in the 1980s. Here, the critical difference was that bipolar disorder had depression and mania and not depression or mania, which aligns more with manic depressive illness. So yeah, in bipolar disorder type 1, there is mania and depression, whereas in bipolar disorder 2, there is hypomania and depression.
Right. So you mentioned these in clinical terms, but like before I go to Sandhya and, for a layman like me, and I assume many of our listeners, the clinical terms do not really translate to understanding what happens. But before I go to Sandhya, I want to ask you one thing. We've seen in many mental health conditions that mood swings are a part of them. But what I understood was that with bipolar disorder, they run into extremes. Really extreme. And how is it different from other conditions? Let's say like our 2 episodes ago, we discussed ADHD. So mood swings are part of that too. But with bipolar disorder, I read everywhere, and every person I spoke to, I read what they wrote. It's incomparable to other things. Or could you tell our listeners how is it different and maybe why? Although it's quite difficult to ascertain why, but
okay. So let's take the case of somebody who let's say has mania. So a person with mania will start to feel incredibly happy, high in mood, or very excited. He or she may feel irritable. They will have increased talkativeness, racing thoughts, increased activity and restlessness. It's not just restricted to the mood. There will be dramatic shifts in mood, energy, and activity levels. The person might start to have grandiose thinking, wherein he or she may have inflated sense of self-esteem, inflated sense of one's abilities. The person will be easily distractible with constant changes in plans. There will be a decreased need for sleep, and the person may become overly sociable or overly familiar. The person might have increased sexual energy, and the person may indulge in reckless spending. So these are some of the classical symptoms of person having mania. So this is how it is different from a person having ADHD. Having said that, there are overlapping symptoms between ADHD and mania, and in bipolar disorder, comorbidity is the rule rather than the exception. To put this into perspective, an overwhelming 20 to 30% of persons with bipolar disorder will have ADHD as a comorbidity.
All right. A study by Laurel Copeland and Alexander Miller with others at US's National Library of Medicine showed that on average, 11.4% of homeless population had bipolar. Among the global population, less than 1% of people have bipolar disorder. In fact, another study in 2015 by US's Department of Housing and Urban Development also found that people who had bipolar disorder also had a much higher chance of remaining homeless. This number was also about 12%. Again, a staggering ratio compared to the overall size. Now let's get back to our conversation.
So I make notes. I was making notes as you were talking. So so about seeing awareness. I'm extremely disheartened by the level of or the lack of awareness that exists in India. Largely, and I absolutely detest. So on the one hand, so you'll have to excuse me when I change. Okay, I'll come around to the point.
It's all
when I
right.
switch around.
This is the reason for this podcast. I'm sorry I'm interrupting you, but the thing is,
No.
when I saw so many people in media talking about any mental illness, be it depression, be it anything, the most common issue to a rare one, they were just preaching, and their speech, the words they said, had no empathy, no understanding of what's going on. This is why this podcast was started. You have enough time and you take as much time as you want. Please go on.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So when I first saw, for example, a Deepika Padukone talk about depression, I was like, okay, here's someone making an inroad into, talking about mental health. But that sort of, I was wary, but I was like, okay, maybe this is a good thing. But what happens with someone like her stature, or someone like her with her stature, or someone like anybody of that level of celebrity, is that the conversation then gets hooked onto that particular thing. It does not evolve into a larger conversation about mental illness.
Yes.
Right. And I don't even know where to begin with it, right? I mean, then after that, a bunch of other celebrities came out saying, oh, depression. Take depression. All right, great. Now, I'm not brushing aside depression at all. I mean, for anyone with a mental illness, depression is part of the parcel, whether you're schizophrenic, whether you're borderline, whether you're any of those things, depression is part of the package, right? So that's something we deal with on a regular basis. But when the conversation stops there, and I'm happy if people with depression have been helped because of celebrity, but when the conversation has stopped there, and I have evolved myself in my journey of writing and talking about my mental illness, right? 10 years ago, when I started writing about it, was when I was 1 month into my diagnosis, and my life looked like it had fallen apart. There was a tone of self-pity. There was a tone of, oh my God, poor me. There was a thing of helpless. There was a tone of helplessness. All of that, right?
Yeah.
Along with what, quote unquote, the vulnerability that people saw, there was also this, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? I'm a 33-year-old with 2 mental illnesses, right? But 10 years down the line, I have watched myself, I've watched others, and I have watched people with, and this is going to sound terrible, and I don't mean any offense, but I need to be honest, and my conscience wouldn't let me rest if I don't say this. But there are serious mental illnesses that have a serious degree of consequence.
Yes.
And there are mental illnesses like anxiety or a depression. Depression again has a spectrum of consequences that are slightly less severe in degree.
Yes.
I'm not saying either of them is more important than the other. I'm just saying something like a schizophrenia destroys lives in ways that you and I cannot imagine unless we've seen people, right? And you have seen them walk down the street talking to themselves, imagining things. You've seen a glimpse of it if you've had an aging grandparent at home with dementia, imagining there are terrorists in trees and gods are giving darshan to them in their bedroom, right? I mean, that's a living daily reality for these people. And when then the media or celebrities talk about mental health, they're actually talking about wellness, mental wellness.
Yes.
Right? They're not talking about mental illness. And mental illness like a schizophrenia or borderline personality okay, let me put that into the mix because it's debilitating as hell. Bipolar disorder, which is like Alok was saying, where where there are no facilities to somebody has a delusion, somebody has hallucinations, auditory, visual, all of that. There's no place for this person to go, and families give up on them.
That was just a snippet. For the full podcast, head over to newslaundry.com, and while you're at it, don't forget to power the work we do by subscribing to Newslaundry and paying to keep news free and independent.
The subscription model is something that keeps Newslaundry afloat, but we need hundreds of thousands of people to completely transform the news ecosystem. So you pay for news, so it serves you. So click on the link with this video, subscribe to Newslaundry and pay to keep news free. और गर्व से कहो, मेरे खर्च पर आज़ाद है खबरें.